they run an unbelievable web of money laundering and shell companies. But there's a question of what level of dirty tricks do you go to in order to topple something that's authoritarian.
We do. I believe we have our guest on the line. I just want to be clear because his titles are long.
It is.
All right.
Yes.
But he's been diving into all things USAID. If you've been actually following the story, you may not know this is the originator of a lot of this information. So this man was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Communications and Information Technology for the State Department. And he was appointed by Donald Trump. This was during the first term. He negotiated U.S. policy on internet diplomacy issues. And then after that, he founded the Foundation for Freedom Online. It's a watchdog group largely dedicated to free speech and an open internet. And he has been doing a lot of the digging here. Let's welcome to the show, Mr. Mike Benz. Mr. Benz, can you hear me, see me, sir? Welcome to be here. Well, sorry, hold on, let me redo this. Glad to have you here. I meant to say welcome or glad to have you, and I screwed it up.
Glad to be had.
Okay, there you go. Well, careful, don't threaten me with a good time. So, you've been talking about this at length. Let me ask you, what spurred you looking into USAID? I mean, I know obviously you were in the Trump administration, but you have been like a dog on a bone on this. Do you think this is even the most egregious example in government, or just one that is going to be pretty easy to prove?
I do think it's actually the most egregious, or certainly in the top 2 or 3 in government. But we're still at the very tip of the iceberg as to why. I think as this onion gets peeled more and more, what you're going to see is something that's actually central to almost all rogue aspects of the way American foreign policy has been run and the way that the foreign policy establishment has been weaponized against domestic politics. The big no-no is that there's supposed to be a firewall between what the CIA does abroad and what it does at home. Right. This is the thing the CIA got in trouble for in the 60s and 70s. The Pentagon is not supposed to be doing stuff at home. The State Department's not supposed to be doing stuff at home, and USAID is not supposed to be doing stuff at home.
Can I ask you about that specifically? Because some people didn't fully understand. I want you to make it really clear when you posted on X that USAID is how the CIA gets shit done. Can you explain that to people who may not be initiated here?
Yes. So the CIA liaises with assets of the U.S. government that are capacity built in order to instrumentalize them for one of 2 purposes, to advance U.S. national security interests or to advance U.S. national interest. Basically, you can think of that like keeping us safe or making us wealthier.
Sure.
For example, if we need the oil in a country, we might do it out of national interest. If we need to topple a government to install a military base there because the prime minister is recalcitrant, then we would say that would be for national security purposes.
Okay.
But the point is that the CIA operates under a plausible deniability cloak. This is it was originally supposed to be parked at the State Department directly in 1948 when this was all being constructed. George Kennan's idea was to have, rather than a CIA operations division, have a State Department Bureau of Political Warfare. But that did not sync well with the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and so they made it a spy agency. Okay. And then the CIA started getting in trouble in the 1960s and 70s with all the scandals of what they were doing, and it moved a substantial amount of its operations into USAID, the humanitarian group. It was a sort of NGO plausible deniability layer for the intelligence world. And USAID is a swing player because it's an independent agency. So it can, what it does is it capacity builds the assets that the CIA then works with. So you can think of it as 3 stools when it comes to advancing U.S. national interests abroad. State Department sets the policy.
Sure.
The CIA will do the operations of telling our assets on the ground what to do and working with them. But none of that works unless those assets are capacity built, meaning they're given money, they're given resources, they're able to beef up their staff. What we do whenever we go into a country is we do what's called the baseline assessment. We look at all of our assets on the ground. We look at how that syncs with our intended foreign policy in the region. We say, okay, what do we have versus what do we need? And USAID plays the lion's share role in plunging that gap to provide those. For example, if we have 14 NGOs in the area and they only have a little bit of money, USAID will find ways to funnel money so that if the State Department says we need 50, or if the CIA says we need 50, USAID will find a way to multiply those institutions, and it will run the money to them. And so they really are, you can't have operations without financing for it. And so USAID plays that role for DOD, for CIA, and for state. And that's why they've become really the most important institution, in American foreign policy.
My follow-up question is, and I know this isn't obviously your framing or fault, you say independent organization. I don't think that means what people think it means at this point. Like, we use this term NGO, and I know people will try and fact me or say this has no legitimate role in government. People are like, well, it's not a government organization. It gets its funding from taxpayers. Can we be clear about this? This is the problem that we face. This is the swamp, right?
Oh, yeah, they don't mean independent from the government. They mean independent from us.
Right. Yes.
It's an unauditable black hole. This is the sort of thing that our former Trump 1 attorney general made his bones doing when Bill Barr started his career in the CIA and then was put by the CIA through night law school and then worked there for 7 years. His marquee job was the CIA's liaison to Congress in order to block congressional oversight of the Central Intelligence Agency during the Iran-Contra scandals of the 1980s. Yep. And he was heralded by the CIA for blocking Congress's ability to oversee the agency. And that is what you see today inside of USAID. And one of the reasons that it's so impossible to get to what they do, and they run an unbelievable web of money laundering and shell companies. I've mentioned this before, but just take one example of USAID's building of the fake social media website called Zunzaneo, which was at a time when Cuba, and look, I'm not a fan of the Cuban, the Cuban government.
Of course
it is an oppressive government. But there's a question of what level of dirty tricks do you go to in order to topple something that's authoritarian. But at the time in 2014, Cuba had banned U.S. social media. So Twitter was not allowed. And the U.S. foreign policy establishment was gassed up over the success of the Arab Spring and the ability of the CIA and State Department to use Facebook and Twitter to angry up populations and get them to form smart mobs and take to the streets and overthrow governments. So they wanted to do a Cuban Spring, but the problem was they had no social media there. Right. So USAID was tasked with creating a fake Cuban version of Twitter. And so in order to do this, they took humanitarian funds that were earmarked for Pakistan and redirected them through a web of shell companies and outside contractors to 2 Cuban businessmen. So it would look like it was coming directly from Cuba. And in the internal documents that were leaked at USAID, the explicit plan was to lure people in using algorithms favoring, quote, sports, music, and hurricane updates. And then once they hit a critical mass of subscribers to the site, they would switch the algorithm to favor anti-government sentiment, street revolutions, and the forming of so-called smart mobs to take to the streets. At the same time, USAID was paying rap groups. One in particular, called the San Isidro Movement, was taking direct money from USAID, who was paying them to write anthems about how to overthrow the government so it could be played to the youth movement. Meanwhile, USAID's kissing cousin, the National Endowment for Democracy, was writing white papers in the background, doing their baseline assessment of the ethnic composition of Cuba. And what it figured out in a 2009 memo that USAID then carried over was that the Afro-Cuban community was underrepresented in the Cuban government, so they could be targeted with angry messages to be the front line. So they're fomenting race riots.
And also, they're not very good at it. If they were trying to lure people to Cuban social media, they did, sports, hurricane updates. They should have just shown them the women. They have a natural resource there. We've seen them here. We've all seen Eva Mendes, correct? And this is the situation, too. People will say, I'm an extremist, where I say, look, the policy on Cuba should be either the United States goes in and liberates these people, does something, or not. But people who will say that's an extremist view, and I'm not saying that we do. I'm saying we need to be clear in our position. Will at the same time defend what is obfuscated and what is opaque, which is effectively, like you're talking about, a soft coup in trying to foment basically racial hatred at that point, which wouldn't be the right way for them to go about it anyway. And no one in this office is hated more than Che Guevara. We were banned for a shirt making fun of him. I know Gerald does have a question, and I know you have a heart out. I wanted to get to Brazil here because we have a lot of people watching, but Gerald, you had a question for Mr. Benz.
Yeah, Mike, so I've seen a lot of people talking about different programs within USAID, and they're not sure which people that are posting are necessarily saying stuff that's true or if they're making some incorrect connections. But you mentioned money laundering, and one of the connections that I've seen people trying to make is basically back through, from U.S. taxes to USAID to NGOs, and then somehow finding its way back into campaigns, PACs, and Dems. Is there a connection there, and is that the biggest money laundering kind of example you can give us, or is there something else?
Oh, there's a huge connection there. Yeah, this is one of the ways that the foreign policy establishment manipulates domestic politics is they take the huge glut of money that we have to manage the American empire abroad, but then if a domestic candidate or domestic political movement is threatening to change U.S. foreign policy, like Donald Trump, has been and currently is, they redirect those funds almost like a white blood cells in an immune system to descend on the internal. They call these the domestic drivers of foreign policy. In order to root those out. And so just a few examples off the top, you have the Tide Center. The Tide Center is basically the clearinghouse for Black Lives Matter. It's also the fiscal sponsor of the group that controls the, quote, Soros prosecutors. You know how Soros has paid for the campaigns of 30% now of America's prosecutors. And so basically everyone who lives in a big metropolitan city is under a Soros prosecutor. Well, Soros also funds the group that not just the campaign, but the actual management of the prosecutors once they're in office to make sure they're in sync with the donor demands, including this group tells them who to prosecute, who not to prosecute, how to structure it, gives them the social media messages, writes their press releases, basically manages them like a talent agency. And that group's fiscal sponsors, the Tide Center. USAID gave the Tide Center $27 million. And some of these grants are incredible. For example, USAID deputizes the Tide Center to, quote, secure concrete commitments from foreign governments on behalf of the U.S. government. So they are pumping up domestic political institutions and then deputizing them to act as a long arm of the U.S. government to actually negotiate U.S. foreign policy abroad, which has a nice synchrony because many of these domestic power players manage economic empires abroad. For example, Soros Inc. is not just the Open Society Foundation, but it's the web of private portfolio companies that profit from the energy resources and economic engine in foreign countries.
And all the while we have been told, well, the danger of Donald Trump is he's sowing mistrust in institutions. Well, I almost think it's the fault of the institutions. Also, I'm very confused. I'm not seeing how any of this helps people with AIDS in Africa. All right, Mr. Benson, I know you're busy. I know you have a hard-out friend of the show, Alan dos Santos. He's a Brazilian journalist, critic of Lula. He reached out to us regarding USAID and Bolsonaro. Can you shed some light on that situation where he was basically telling us, I didn't get the full story, it happened last minute before we went live, that USAID helped perhaps install Lula in Brazil? Okay.
Yeah.
So how did that, I know there's probably a web and a funnel, but give us the general kind of the snapshot, I guess, to start.
Sure. So in 2016, Donald Trump won the U.S. presidency, and along with his rise to power, a ring of so-called populist candidates began winning elections all over the world. For example, in Europe, you had Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, Matteo Salvini, the Vox Party in Spain, the rise of the AfD Party in Germany. And at the time, NATO and the U.S. foreign policy establishment were worried that populism, because it's the will of the people rather than the consensus of the institutions, it's basically a nationalism versus globalism story here, was going to destroy and basically end the so-called rules-based international order. Brexit would give rise to Frexit, Spexit, it'll exit, Grexit. The EU would come undone, NATO would come undone, and the ring of populist leaders in countries in South America and in Central Asia would form what they feared was essentially a new non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement was this pact of countries during the Cold War who said that they were not aligned with either of the two major powers, the U.S. or the Soviet Union, that they would would do business with both, which was a big thorn in the side of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, who wanted to starve out the Soviet Union economically and block the interlinkages. So they feared that these populist political candidates would, destroy the rules-based international order and form this new non-aligned movement bloc. And so when Bolsonaro won the election in October 2018, USAID and its web of sister entities in the foreign policy establishment, in particular the National Endowment for Democracy, decided internally and talked about this even in their own panels and source documents, that Bolsonaro was a populist threat to democracy. And as democracy promotion programs, USAID is and National Endowment for Democracy are, that they then had the remit to overthrow the government of Brazil in order to stop the populist attack on democracy there. And so what they did is they then flooded the zone. They more than doubled the USAID budget and NED budget for Brazil, more than doubled the so-called foreign assistance. But what they pumped that into were into anti-Bolsonaro institutions. And what really activated me on this issue, as someone who's centrally focused on internet censorship, is that USAID and NED capacity built, meaning they funded and built all of the key institutions inside of Brazil that Brazilians think, if they don't know this backstory, are Brazilian, but are in fact on the payroll of the U.S. government in order to advocate for the passage of censorship laws and even to construct the machinations and operations of the very censorship court, the TSE. This is the subsection of the Brazilian Supreme Court that's responsible for adjudicating elections and for censoring the internet in the name of preserving the integrity of elections. Right. This is the de Moraes judge. And so they packed that court. They packed it with their judicial clerks, with their legal folks. They packed it with their disinformation flaggers. They helped form the disinformation task force at TSE. The U.S. government, USAID and NED, even brought in de Moraes and as well as the head of the STF for training on disinformation, so that they could personally micro target, and use the best American censorship techniques in order to nuke Bolsonaro from orbit. And actually, one of these U.S.-sponsored organizations that got $5.7 million from the U.S. government to do this said that Bolsonaro would have been president unless they had done this. Yeah.
Well, and a lot of people don't realize the Supreme Court there in Brazil actually holds significantly more sway than here. We've had these journalists on the program, and Rumble, of course, banned from Brazil. I wonder, which brings me to another question, because I know you're a free speech, not only activist, but obviously the Watchdog group that you run focuses on that. You have also put out there that USA is active in organizing like boycotts of advertisers. And what was the name of they run 80% of advertising that boycotted us? What was it called?
Is it Diageo? No.
Diageo. Yes.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, Diageo sent out a notice to Rumble saying that we actually won't allow any advertisers on Rumble unless you ban yours truly. So it wasn't enough to be demonetized on YouTube, then move to Rumble. They wanted to forcibly change Rumble's ability to have their own creators. So tell us about USAID with advertiser boycotts, and if it does include organizations like Diageo.
Yeah, may I ask what year or what month or
that
year
that was 2024, toward the end of it, middle 2024. Diageo. There was a statement from Dunkin' Donuts saying they wouldn't, not just on our show, we don't care, they wouldn't allow their advertisers on Rumble unless we were booted.
Fascinating. Well, so I don't know a specific connection between USAID and Diageo, but part of the task that I see the Trump administration taking on is as we do the autopsy and audit of USAID and its internal documents, the specifics of this in terms of who exactly USAID was working with and what exact communications and the timeline chronology. That's the sort of thing that has been difficult for me to access open source. Sure. But what I can tell you is that USAID, beginning in 2017, when it was terrified that Donald Trump had only won the U.S. election in 2016 because of a free and open internet, their own Spocks were saying that it was only because of unfiltered alternative news that social media, that Donald Trump won the election. What they did is they engaged in a systematic campaign in order to re-engineer the economics of the news industry, and they fixated on the supply of revenue to alternative news sites, with the idea being that it's easier to kill the messenger than it is to stop the messages because there's only a much smaller web of institutions producing the news. And so they sought to capacity cripple it in the same way that USAID capacity builds its own favored institutions. And so one document that I produced publicly a year and a half ago, and there's much more behind that, and I'll be publishing about that prolifically in the months ahead.
And where can people find it? Just to make sure I plug and people know where to find your information.
You can go right now, and you can go to foundationforfreedomonline.com. Just go to the search bar, type in USAID, and you will see the 97-page internal document that Joe Biden, 1 month into Joe Biden's presidency, this is February 2021, basically the seat was just barely warm at the White House when his USAID produced a 97-page document where 31 times in this 97-page document, they stress the imperative to kill advertiser revenue to so-called misinformation websites, misinformation social media accounts, and to dogpile on social media companies and find ways to both domestically. And here's the thing, they also pushed foreign censorship laws to block out U.S. websites favoring Donald Trump, which is a whole nother can of worms because they couldn't do that under the First Amendment. Right. So what they did is, frankly, treasonously went abroad to pay institutions in foreign countries to promote the kind of censorship laws that would not even be allowed in the United States. But one of the things that they had whole annexes in this document about ways to reach out to advertisers and the importance of cutting the financial cutting the financial flow of funds to populist websites. In that document, they said the express purpose of it was to stop the production of what they called a populist subject matter expertise online, where right-wing populists are able to talk to each other peer-to-peer and form a cogent and unifying message that they can coast to political victories around the world. So it's explicit political targeting, paid for by the U.S. taxpayer.
Well, did you know, I don't know if you know this, but I was the biggest conservative YouTube channel ever. Right here, right now, we're of course on Rumble Premium. Biggest election stream ever. In 2016, demonetized completely, though we didn't violate policy, and then we were banned from covering the midterm elections with a bogus claim. So we couldn't cover it. And then when we came back, we covered on Rumble this last election, again, biggest online election stream ever. So we were demonetized, banned from live streaming, a midterm, and then this last year, Diageo said, actually, it's not enough that he's off of YouTube. It's not enough that this entire organization is off of YouTube channel. We're going to apply pressure to Rumble, where we won't allow anyone to advertise on Rumble unless this person is removed from that platform. So we've been in the thick of it for a long time. I'd be very curious to see the results of that auditing. I know Jill does one more question, and I know you have to go, Mr. Benz. Thank you so much for your time.
Right, and just a quick follow-up, and again, we know you have to go, but we want to make sure we do some further work with you. So if there's a way that we can help get some of that information out, we want to make sure that we use the platform to do this. You stopped short a second ago.
Yeah, I've seen you guys in the files dating years back. I mean, they target you guys like...
Well, then we definitely have to talk, and I know you're a very busy man right now.
You guys are targeted by DHS.
Yeah.
Ugh. Well,
yeah. So I didn't know it, but I know it. I mean, I suspected.
Well, that stinks. So we'll talk about that. But Mike, you stopped short a minute ago when you were talking about the Soros-funded DAs. Are you saying that through USAID, through taxpayer dollars, through USAID, through foundations, NGOs, that George Soros DAs, we paid for the prosecution of Donald Trump in part, indirectly?
Well, let me clarify that because it's there's some technical distinctions.
Sure.
The money went to that group's fiscal sponsor, the group that it gets its 501c3 through. And so, technically it was not directly to the entity, it was to its fiscal sponsor. And so there's a lot of bleed between 501c3s and the dark umbrella that allows them to shield, the donors there. Oftentimes that fiscal sponsor will also provide a range of services for the group that it's for the project group that it's giving the 501c3 to. And so it was capacity building the fiscal sponsor of it rather than it directly, if that's clarifying. But I do have to jump.
I know. Thank you, Mr. Benz. We want to have you back on soon. We appreciate your expertise, and everyone go follow him, support his organization. We'll have the plugs right there in the description. Mr. Benz, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, guys.
Be well. Hey, if you like this video, you can hit the notification bell there to know when new videos come out, because I don't think subscriptions are still a thing on YouTube, but you're an adult, most likely, so you can just choose one of the videos here to keep watching. And hopefully it's similar. I don't know what it is.